spot on, right? Urban air pollution expert and the impact that it has on all of us. So without further ado, I'd just simply like to say, Dr. Happy, thank you so much for coming. Obviously, we're very interested in what you might have to say. Okay.
Thanks, Paula. Thanks to all of you for coming. Obviously, this is an issue that nobody here cares about, right? So I wanted to briefly share what I'm going to talk about today. I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, I study air pollution and how people are exposed to air pollution. So I come at this very much from the engineering and physical science side, but I have lots of friends who are epidemiologists who study the health effects of air pollution. I think that's something that everybody here is intensely interested in, and I'm going to try to communicate what I can about that, although I'm not an air pollution health expert. So in addition to talking about the science, I care a lot about the policy. I work in India because this is such a great opportunity to do something about air pollution. In the US, we've largely solved many of our air pollution challenges. Here we really can make a big difference. And so I'm going to talk a bit about how scientists and policymakers and to some extent the American community here in Delhi can contribute to the solutions to the problem. And of course everybody wants to know how they can protect themselves from air pollution here, and I'll say what I can about that. So first, I have a great debt to many people who've helped me in this work. This is not just my work that I'm showing here today. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming. So we're back in the province of winter air pollution nightmares here in Delhi. It's starting to get bad again, and it was really bad this past winter. And there's lots of press coverage written by some of the people in this room about how bad the air pollution has been in Delhi consistently every winter. And so this is something that I think every year starts to focus the policy attention on air pollution. People start to wake up and want to do something about it, and then as the pollution gets better in the middle of the year, the attention comes off again. But here we are in the thick of it again, no pun intended. And I think we have an opportunity to really start building some momentum and do something about this challenge. So if there's one reason that air pollution in India is important, it's because it has major health effects. So this is a list of what makes people sick and die in India, coming from a major authoritative global study called the Global Burden of Disease. And what it shows is that, so the colored bars on top are the top 5 risk factors for premature death in India, and 2 out of those top 5 risk factors are air pollution. The one that's in the middle, household air pollution from solid fuels, is something that's predominantly but not exclusively a rural problem. About 1 million people in India die due to poor indoor air quality from cooking with solid fuels in villages and in slums and cities. And then about 600,000 people die due to outdoor air pollution, ambient PM pollution. That's the 5th largest risk factor for premature death in India. And 600,000 people a year should sound like a lot of people dying. Obviously there's no body count because what that comes from is a variety of different diseases that air pollution interacts with. But when you compare that to some of the other major risk factors for premature death in India, you see just how important air pollution is. So outdoor air pollution kills 3 times as many people as AIDS and malaria put together in India. So air pollution is a health challenge on par with any of the other big global health challenges that the health community has traditionally addressed. And I think what this points to is that there will be growing attention to this problem in the future just because of what a big deal air pollution is. So what pollutants should we care about? If there's one pollutant we should focus our attention on here, it's PM 2.5, fine particulate matter. Fine particles are much, much smaller than a human hair. They can penetrate deep into our lungs, and there's really conclusive evidence coming from decades of studying this in the US and in Europe also, that PM 2.5 has major adverse health impacts. Sort of the big headline numbers that drive mortality are related to, of course, respiratory diseases and lung cancer. And you might logically make that connection, that air pollution drives respiratory diseases. But if you look at what actually kills people, it's not just the respiratory diseases, but heart disease and stroke are really the 2 major killers that are driven by outdoor air pollution. So not directly connected to our lungs, but of course our lungs and our circulatory system interact. So that's not what we most naturally think about. And of course, when it comes to kids, I'm really less of an expert on air pollution's health effects on kids, but outdoor air pollution, of course, has a major effect on lung function and lung development and asthma and things that we should really care about as well. So the the World Health Organization says that a safe long-term exposure level of PM 2.5 is 10 micrograms per cubic meter. And the US EPA has a slightly laxer standard of 12, and that's because the WHO standard is based on just the medical evidence and epidemiological evidence, whereas the EPA has to factor politics in as well. In any case, here in India, average levels in cities are 50, 100, 150, 200 micrograms per cubic meter over the course of a year. So much higher. And these are the kind of problems that get me excited, because this is a challenge where we're going to have to figure out over the coming years and decades how to reduce PM 2.5 by a factor of 10 or more in India if we want to have good air quality and good public health in cities. So where does PM 2.5 come from? PM comes from really a variety of sources in India, including, so there's a sort of holy trinity of sources really. Road transport, industry, power generation, those account for about half of the PM 2.5 in India. That is coming directly out of sort of exhaust stacks and tailpipes. Then there's this great diversity of other sources that emit PM 2.5 in Indian cities that are less well understood and less regulated. These are things like the diesel backup gensets that we have to, get power when the power goes out. People burning waste at landfills and in their driveways and so on. And of course, many of us have, I don't, but I'm sure many of you do have guards that sit out front of your homes at night. And that's a nice thing to be able to have guards, but of course, these guys need to stay warm at night, and many of these people have fire, so it always smells like wood smoke when you wake up in the morning, and of course that's because people are burning wood to stay warm here in the winter. Road dust and construction are also important. So those are the direct sources of PM 2.5. PM 2.5 isn't just directly emitted, though. It's also formed through all sorts of processes that relate to atmospheric chemistry. So gases that are emitted from vehicles and power plants and all the other sources we've been talking about actually form PM 2.5 in the atmosphere as well. We don't know so much about that process in Delhi, but typically in most places in the world it accounts for about half of the PM 2.5. And you can't just go measure that because it's formed in the atmosphere. So that's where you really need the scientific capacity to understand this secondary PM 2.5. So how does this all add up in terms of the health effects of PM? This is a map of who dies from PM 2.5 in the United States. So the redder the color, the more people that are dying per square kilometer from PM 2.5. And really it maps onto our cities in the US. And why might that be the case? Well, first, population density is really telling part of the story here. More people are living in cities, so more people die in cities, right? But also, our pollution in the US is really coincident with our urban areas. So the places with higher levels of PM 2.5 in the US, which never reached Indian levels, by the way, but there are higher and lower places. LA is dirtier than, say, Omaha. Those places have higher mortality rates. And then you can see some other cities and other parts of North America that also jump out. So Mexico City and some other places. I want you to focus on the reddest of red colors here, because I really just put this map up for scale with India. So here's India. Lots more red, right? Well, it kind of makes sense because there's lots more people, right? But the pollution levels in India, as we know, are much higher. And a lot of the mortality is really concentrated in the north of India, where air pollution is considerably worse than in South India. But one of the really striking things here, in addition to just the fact that there's so much more red, so much more health impacts of air pollution, is how it doesn't just map out to the cities. It's not just an urban problem here, but really a regional problem as well. So we have to control air pollution in Indian cities, but let's not just forget the cities. There's quite a bit that can still be done related to the monitoring of air pollution, because any good policy making needs to have some basis in fact, right? And one of the things that we need in order to evaluate our progress, and also to know how much we need to clean up, is the data about ambient air quality. So India's been making actually pretty good progress in installing large networks of ambient air quality monitors, but of course the progress is relative to a pretty low baseline. And so there are still some concerns about the official data, and I think this is one of the reasons that the US Embassy installed their own monitor here, to just have some more control over what they're monitoring right here in the compound. So this is an example of some data from one government monitor, where suddenly in the middle of the data set, this week-long flat line of air pollution shows up in a monitor that was otherwise collecting hourly data. And that suggests that the monitors aren't being maintained properly, or the data collection, something fun was going on there. And so that there are important quality concerns about the official data. We have this anywhere, but traditionally these government data collection entities have not released data to the public in large volumes so that people don't pay that much attention to the data, and it doesn't always inspire confidence. So there are big holes in what we know about air pollution in India. Thankfully, we have this monitor right here, so at least we know what the air pollution levels are, just so that in the immediate vicinity here. So many of you might want to know this very simple question: what is a safe level? What should I be doing? What should my kids be doing? And again, I'm not a health expert, so I would defer to what the US EPA recommends about this. And this, of course, is really conditioned on, you have to keep in mind that US EPA's guidance is coming from a place where PM2.5 concentrations rarely exceed 30 or 40 micrograms per cubic meter. So it's not designed with people here in mind, but still they have their scale and their statements about what people should do, and I thought I would just share that with you. So they have this 6 tiers of air quality index. And so this is actually a confusing feature about PM2.5, is that air quality index numbers and the actual mass concentration numbers for PM2.5 are often sort of in the same scale. So, for instance, the good AQI ranges from 0 to 50 on the AQI scale, and from 0 to 12 on the PM2.5 actual mass scale. So it inevitably introduces some confusion because the numbers look similar enough alike that it's not easy unless you specify the units, whether you're talking about things in AQI or in PM2.5 levels. I'm a scientist, so I talk about the mass concentrations and not the AQI. Anyway, what you see on the statement side of this table is an increasing severity of what people ought to be doing with increasing levels of PM2.5. So I checked the PM2.5 levels at my house this morning. They're about 200 micrograms per cubic meter, so off this scale, this chart. But let's look at the statements. So at moderate, unusually sensitive people should consider reducing their prolonged or heavy exertion. When we go up to unhealthy for sensitive groups, and that would include kids, they say that kids should reduce prolonged or heavy exertion. And I would interpret this as, for instance, playing a sport outside. That for me would be prolonged or heavy exertion at least. Now let's move up the scale. When you reach the unhealthy level of 55 to 150 micrograms per cubic meter, children should avoid prolonged and heavy exertion. And when you reach very unhealthy, children should avoid all physical activity outdoors. So I would interpret that to do anything walking around. And then at the hazardous level, children should remain indoors and keep all activities low. So what are these levels like in Delhi at different points in time? Air pollution actually is tremendously variable in space and in time. So this is a typical year in Delhi. This is the year from middle 2013 to the middle 2014, measured at one official monitor in South Delhi at RK Puram. I got this data set from a colleague. I actually can't share the data with you yet, but here you look at the slide and see when the 35 and 55 levels are crossed. So that's just going back to our scale here. The 35 level crosses unhealthy for sensitive groups, so kids should start reducing their activity. And when you reach the red line, children should avoid prolonged or heavy activity outside. So reducing and avoiding. And you can see that for most of the year, the average daily concentration falls above that level. This is really not a good situation that we have here. And then what I'm showing here is actually the daily average concentrations, but air pollution varies quite a bit during the day. So you notice it's more in the morning than in the middle of the afternoon. So here is a bad winter month in Delhi, last November. And you can see that for every hour of the day, it was above those levels. What I don't have for you here is a figure coming from the summer, when actually in the summer there are several hours every day where the levels do drop below these sort of levels of concern. But there are long periods during the year when the levels are considerably higher than what we really might like to see. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news about this, but this is just what I can observe from the data. I wish it weren't so. So now I want to talk about something that comes directly from my own research about how levels of air pollution, when you go about a city, differ from what official government monitors might tell you, or official rooftop monitors might tell you. So most air pollution monitors are not located at ground level or near major roads or near the places where we actually spend tend to spend a lot of their time. Most monitors are located on the top of roofs, far away from roads, so that they don't capture just what's happening on the roadway, but sort of the background mix. And there's a really logical reason for this. If you can only afford 5 monitors for your city, for example, you don't want to just put them where they're just telling you what the nearest road is doing. You want them to tell you something about the background mix. But of course, often if you go around in Delhi, as you can see from this auto rickshaw picture here on the left, we're often no more than a few meters from an exhaust pipe. And some of those exhaust pipes aren't so pretty. So what we did is we spent about 4 months driving around in traffic inside auto rickshaws, which of course are unenclosed, collecting real-time data about 3 types of particulate matter, trying to understand how the levels inside rickshaws are different from the background levels of air pollution that an official monitor might be telling you about. So we built this rickshaw-based exposure laboratory where basically me and my colleagues drove around for about 4 months of this thing during rush hour traffic, measuring PM2.5, which of course we've been talking a lot about, and then 2 other types of particulate matter that are actually more useful for telling us about traffic. So black carbon is what the black stuff you see when you see a really sooty exhaust plume coming out of the vehicle. And that actually has an important effect on the climate as well, for climate change. But it's a really good marker of traffic pollution from poorly operating vehicles. It also comes from wood smoke and some other things. Ultrafine particles are much, much smaller particles that are often about 100 times smaller than the particles that make up PM2.5. They're a really good marker for traffic air pollution in many cities, and they're an additional concern because they can penetrate very deep into our lungs. And the key result from our measurements is that, well, we know that the background air in Delhi is pretty polluted, but on-road air, not surprisingly, is quite a bit worse. So for PM2.5, levels inside auto rickshaws are about 50% higher than in the ambient air. And you might think, oh, 50%, well, it's not so much, but it's 50% against a pretty high baseline, right? So during our study, PM2.5 concentrations in the background are about 140 micrograms per cubic meter, and inside the auto rickshaw, they're closer to 200. This was done in a cleaner time of year, so 140 is, the 200, I should say, inside the auto rickshaw is kind of like what the ambient levels are here in Delhi today. Black carbon and ultrafine particles were actually much more substantially enhanced inside the vehicles because those pollutants are much better markers of just traffic air pollution as opposed to the whole mix. So 4 and 8 times higher for black carbon and ultrafine particles. There's actually a bit of good news here, which is that the auto rickshaw represents the worst case scenario for on-road exposure, right? And that's because it's unenclosed and you're really getting the tailpipe right next to you. Of course, that is probably a pretty representative picture of what most people in Delhi would be experiencing because they don't have the luxury of being in a nice, relatively new air-conditioned car. If you are in a new air-conditioned car, you can roll up the windows, turn on the air conditioning, and put the fan on recirculate. And typically that will reduce levels by half or more, just because the particles will get deposited in the filtration system of the vehicle, and the air sticks around inside the car for long enough for the particles to settle out. So please do that when you go out on the road. I also wanted to give you a real picture of what it's like to be out on the road, and so I made a video. You can play this. So we're driving around in traffic here, and the number you see on top is the PM2.5 level. And it goes up and goes down because we're near vehicles, so we're going in and out of their exhaust plumes, right? So it's 150, and then just went way up, and it's actually because there's a diesel truck right next to us, and that's sort of the centerpiece of this video. So now it's at 500, and it's getting better, getting worse. And then watch this poor guy on the motorbike. So it just went to 3,000, right? So we all know what this is like. I mean, this is not the first time you've seen something like this, but no, there's numbers behind it. That's not necessarily a good situation to be in either. But then I wanted to know, well, what if you hold your breath? And it turns out that if you could know, like strategically, at that instant, how high the level was, and just hold the breath for 10 seconds when you saw those plumes coming. This is like very much a hypothetical, right? But if you did know that, for some of the pollutants, like black carbon and ultrafines, you probably could shave 30% off your exposure just by holding your breath for those instants, if you had perfect control over that. Of course, we shouldn't have to hold our breath for clean air here, but that does suggest that there are things we can do to protect ourselves. On a more sobering note, this isn't just about being inside the vehicles, though, but also that lots of people live on the roads here or have lives that take them on the roads. People who are vendors on the streets, people who drive rickshaws, for instance, for 12 hours a day, and also the people who just live in neighborhoods that are close to major roads. So about 60% of Delhi's population lives in what we think to be the impact zone for major roadways. So this includes within 500 meters of a really major highway and within 50 meters of a minor road. So that just suggests that this is not just about the people who are, when you're driving around, but being near roads is probably not a good thing. Now, okay, I've said lots of doom and gloom, but now why am I here? It's because I believe that India's air quality problems are really solvable. So we want to reduce air pollution levels in Indian cities by roughly an order of magnitude. And of course, India has so many other things that it needs to do at just the very same time, right? So the population is going to continue to grow. The economy, of course, has to grow to lift so many people out of poverty. Climate change is a major sort of becoming issue, and of course, there's so many other priorities. But California was in a roughly a similar situation 50 years ago when my parents were growing up in LA. And bad days in Los Angeles then were not so different from bad days in many Indian cities today, or maybe medium days in many Indian cities today. So the point is California licked its air pollution problem, and of course California's economy didn't seem to suffer as a result of it. It has one of the highest GDPs of any sort of entity anywhere in the world. And we managed to reduce per capita emissions of what were at the time two rather important pollutants, carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide, by nearly an order of magnitude in about 35 years. So what did that take? So California had it hard. It had to invent many of the control technologies to clean up air pollution, like catalytic converters weren't invented when that problem started. So the laws in California basically required vehicles to become cleaner over time, and car manufacturers had to invent those technologies. India does not have to invent cleanup technologies because many of these already exist, although I'm sure it can innovate new and lower cost ways of cleaning up pollution. But what did it really take? It took the political commitment and the sort of desire to make long-term progress towards that goal. And so what I'm trying to say here is that long-term reductions in air pollution in India really are completely possible. It just requires putting the policies in place to do so, and then continuing to stick with it when it seems tough at times. I wanted to also stress that there are a variety of different approaches to cleaning up air pollution that mean that it's not as difficult as just saying we need to develop control technologies that remove 90% of the pollution that passed through them. So it's not just about end-of-tailpipe solutions or end-of-smokestack solutions where you are trying to remove 90% of the pollution coming through. There are lots of things you can do sort of in a complementary way to clean up air pollution. So like reduce, recycle, reuse is sort of our recycling mantra in the US. Something similar kind of applies to air pollution, which is that, of course, to the extent that you reduce the need for a source, you also reduce its impact. And so India has, I think, really important choices to make about what, say, its transportation future will look like over the next 50 years. Or how efficient its cities will be 50 years from now. By 2050, India's urban population really is going to surge, and those buildings and those road networks and the whole city has not been planned yet to accommodate that surge in population. So the choices that are made about how much demand for energy will be required for transportation, for instance, are still completely undecided, and I think that this is really one of the greatest opportunities for hope, and it's why I continue to work in India, is that setting that baseline demand is something that has not yet been decided. Then the question of efficiency also comes up, right? So if you have higher fuel economy in your vehicles, there's less pollution being controlled just because less fuel is being burned. And then of course you do need control technologies. So what are the sorts of things that are required to clean up air pollution in India? So vehicle emission standards here lag behind global norms, and there's a real opportunity to aggressively deploy cleaner vehicle technologies. And how aggressive is just a really political decision, an economic decision about how quickly companies can retool their manufacturing, how much pain they're willing to withstand, and how much courage, basically, politicians have to, resist any calls for cleaning up pollution. Because it does cost money, right? It's not free. On the power generation side, a surprisingly small fraction of India's coal power generation fleet has water emission controls installed. So remember I mentioned secondary particulate matter? A lot of that secondary particulate matter comes from sulfur dioxide being emitted by coal power plants. And only just a bit about 10% of India's coal power plants have that technology installed right now. That's something that's a really proven technology. It's been installed in US plants for decades, and retrofitting Indian plants and making sure that new plants have that should be a really important priority. I've already talked about urban planning, how important that's going to be in terms of course, the car ownership is going to increase in India because it's really low today. But sort of making sure that every Indian city doesn't look like Los Angeles is probably a good idea. And then there needs to be a lot of investment in sort of the scientific infrastructure of making sure that when people graduate from IITs and they've had some background in engineering, that some of those really bright people stay in India to work on air pollution as opposed to going to work for Microsoft or going to come be my PhD students in the US. So that's obviously phenomenally important. And then of course, air quality is not a problem that really needs to be solved alone, but rather air quality can be solved at the same time as addressing really other pressing issues. So I already mentioned how big the health impact of air pollution is, and so cleaning up air pollution, of course, has direct benefits for public health, and that, of course, has benefits for the economy. Air pollution has this very favorable aspect, which is that many of the sources that are major sources of air pollution are also major sources of CO2, and so they affect global warming as well. And so there's a real opportunity to address climate change at the same time as addressing air pollution. So India could address its air pollution problem, make a big dent in the climate problem, without ever having climate be a priority. So this is, I think, a really important sort of political thing that India can make important progress on climate change, while really doing something that's very much in its own self-interest. And then there's emerging research that air pollution has a really big impact on food security, which of course is really important to a large and growing country like India. So air pollution has a really big effect on crop yields that's starting to come out, and that's something that I think policymakers will pay into attention over time. So for the really big picture, what's going to drive change in India? So from here I can comment about what really made things change in the US. There are sort of three things that came out that required each other to really have an impact together. So one is the health studies about air pollution that showed how damaging it was. And the first ones that we saw in the US were not even studies, they were really like natural experiments where there was an episode in an industrial town in Pennsylvania where hundreds of people died within just a few days due to a really bad pollution episode. And then people woke up and thought, hey, that's a big deal. You can think of the London fog as another really great example of that, where thousands of people died over just a few weeks from a really bad pollution episode there. But health studies have become more sophisticated over time, and in order to become more sophisticated, they need monitoring data. So it's really hard to do health studies in India because there's not that much monitoring data about air pollution yet. And then, of course, the scientific basis for how you control air pollution, what it's made up of, requires monitoring data as well. And once you have all three of those things coming together, the public awareness really starts to grow about the problem. And there's sort of feedback here. As the public starts demanding, hey, there's a problem, let's do something about it, then it's easier to justify spending money on monitoring and health studies and all the regulations. So I think, I'm not just mentioning this because this is sort of what I think needs to happen and this is my crystal ball, but I'm really honored to be speaking to this audience because so many of you are actually in a position where in many ways your professional work touches this problem, or your professional work might touch this problem in the future, so I really have that in mind as I'm speaking to you. And then I think there's really this question about what we can do to protect ourselves. And I wanted to spend a fair amount of time talking about this and really make myself available to you guys as well, to the extent that I have anything useful to offer here about how one can protect oneself. So I think that the single greatest opportunity for near-term protection of yourself when you're here in Delhi, or any population here in Delhi, is to control the air pollution indoors. So most of the bad air indoors in Delhi comes from outdoors, and that's because buildings here tend to be rather open compared to many buildings that you see elsewhere. And So what we need then are large banks of air cleaners that filter the particles out of the air. And these aren't necessarily